There are moments in our lives when we stand at the threshold between who we have been and who we are becoming, and these moments arrive with such ordinary disguise that we almost miss them, believing them to be just another day, just another breath, just another heartbeat in the infinite rhythm of our existence. But something inside us knows better. Something in our nervous system recognizes that the world is about to shift, that the ground beneath our feet is preparing to rearrange itself into something we will not recognize when we turn around to look behind us. For Maria, this moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 months before her wedding, when she sat in her mother's kitchen with her sister Isabel, and the afternoon light fell across the white marble table like liquid gold, illuminating dust particles that danced in slow, deliberate circles, and her mother had just left the room to take a phone call, and in that sudden silence, Isabel leaned forward with an intensity that made Maria's stomach tighten, that made her nervous system flood with a subtle alarm that she would spend the next 72 hours trying to convince herself she had imagined. Isabel said, "Mama mentioned that you're thinking of having a small wedding, just close family, nothing too grand," and the way she said it, with that particular tilt of her head, with that smile that never quite reached her eyes, with that tone that suggested she was offering comfort when she was actually cataloging information, made Maria realize something fundamental about the architecture of their relationship, something she had been avoiding for 32 years, that they were not two sisters bound by blood and history and shared childhood memories in the way that sisters are supposed to be, but rather two people competing for the same finite resources of parental love, attention, and validation, two plants growing in the same pot, their roots entangling and strangling each other in the dark soil beneath the surface where no one could see the damage being done. Maria had always known this, but she had never allowed herself to know it, if that distinction makes sense. The way we can hold a truth in our bodies while our conscious mind refuses to acknowledge it, the way trauma lives in our cells before it ever reaches our awareness. And as her sister spoke about the wedding plans, asking innocent questions about the guest list, the venue, the decorations, Maria felt something shifting inside her nervous system, felt the amygdala beginning to sound its alarm bells, felt the subtle release of cortisol into her bloodstream, even though on the surface, she was smiling and answering the questions in that bright, cheerful voice that she had perfected over decades of making herself smaller to accommodate her sister's larger-than-life presence. But before we venture deeper into Maria's story, we need to understand something essential about the human family system, about the way that love and competition can become so intertwined that we cannot separate them without breaking both, about the way that siblings are both our first friends and our first rivals, both our greatest supporters and our most sophisticated saboteurs. Because they know us in a way that other people never can, they know the exact locations of our vulnerabilities, the precise words that will shatter us, the specific moments when we are weakest, and they carry this knowledge across decades, updating it as we grow and change, a living archive of all the ways they can hurt us if they choose to do so. In the field of family psychology, there is something called sibling transference, which is the way that the dynamics we develop with our brothers and sisters become the template through which we approach all of our future relationships, the unconscious blueprint that we use to navigate the world. And Maria had spent her entire adult life replaying her relationship with Isabel in every romantic partnership she had ever had, choosing men who were emotionally unavailable in the same way her sister was emotionally distant, men who made her feel constantly as though she was not enough, as though she needed to prove her worth, as though the ground beneath her feet was constantly shifting. And now, as she stood on the precipice of the most important commitment of her life, all of these old patterns were waking up inside her, stretching their wings, preparing to sabotage everything she had worked so hard to build. Maria's fiancé, David, was different from the men she had chosen before, and this was precisely why her nervous system was so activated in the presence of her sister, because David actually loved her, actually saw her, actually believed that she was enough exactly as she was, and this triggered something ancient and terrifying inside Maria, because if David was different, then the familiar pattern was breaking. And if the familiar pattern was breaking, then Maria would have to reorganize her entire identity around the new reality that she was worthy of love, that she was worthy of a man who chose her not because of what she could do for him, but because of who she fundamentally was, and this kind of reorganization is like asking the human nervous system to rewire its entire operating system while the machine is still running. Like asking the brain to rebuild its neural pathways while it is simultaneously trying to survive. And it is one of the most difficult, most painful, most necessary things that any of us can do. Isabel had never married, had never had a long-term relationship that lasted more than 18 months, had built her entire identity around being the beautiful one, the accomplished one, the one who was always the center of attention, and as Maria's engagement was announced, Isabel's internal world became a landscape of crisis, because she was losing her primary source of identity, her primary source of external validation, her primary reason to believe that she was special, and this is where the human psyche begins to do very complicated things. This is where the unconscious mind starts to manufacture solutions that look like support from the outside but are actually calculated campaigns of sabotage wearing the mask of sisterly concern. The invitations to the wedding had been sent out 2 weeks before that Tuesday conversation in the kitchen, and they were beautiful, designed by an artist friend of Maria's, cream-colored cardstock with illustrations of pomegranates and olive branches, Spanish details that honored her family's roots in Andalusia, and Maria had spent hours addressing them by hand, had felt a quiet joy in that simple act of creation, had imagined the faces of the people she loved as they opened their mailboxes, and discovered this announcement of her happiness. But Isabel, when she received hers, had felt something quite different, had felt a subtle sense of displacement, because the wedding was not her event, was not about her, was not a stage where she could perform her particular kind of beauty and brilliance, and in that moment, something shifted in her intentions, something moved from passive resentment into active strategy. The first hint of what was to come arrived in the form of a phone call from their mother, Valentina, who had a particular way of delivering information that was both confessional and accusatory, that made the listener feel simultaneously like the chosen confidant and the accused criminal, and she said to Maria, very casually, as though she were commenting on the weather, that Isabel had suggested that the wedding date was actually quite inconvenient for her, that she had a work commitment that weekend, an important conference in Barcelona that she had been planning to attend for months, and wouldn't it make more sense to move the wedding to a different weekend so that Isabel could attend, so that the family could be complete. And as Maria listened to her mother speak these words, she felt something crystallize inside her, felt her nervous system suddenly snap into focus, felt the ancient part of her brain that handles threat detection suddenly activate with a clarity that was almost physically painful. Because what Maria understood in that moment, with a knowledge that bypassed her conscious mind and spoke directly to the deepest parts of her knowing, was that her sister was lying, that there was no conference, that this was the opening move in a larger campaign, and something inside her, some small voice that she had been learning to listen to in therapy, some internal compass that she had been slowly learning to trust, told her that if she did not take action now, if she did not establish a clear boundary now, then the next 3 months would be consumed by her sister's manipulation, and her wedding day would belong to Isabel instead of to her, would be about managing her sister's drama instead of celebrating her love. So Maria did something that terrified her, something that her nervous system was not accustomed to doing, because her nervous system had been trained from infancy to accommodate her sister, to make herself smaller, to abandon her own needs in the service of keeping the family system stable, and she called her mother back within the hour and she said, very quietly, very clearly, with a steadiness in her voice that she did not entirely feel, that she understood that Isabel had other commitments. And she hoped that Isabel would be able to find a way to attend, but that the wedding date was not negotiable, that this was Maria's celebration, and it would take place on the date that she had chosen, and if Isabel was unable to attend, then Maria would miss her, but the wedding would proceed without her, and there would be no change to accommodate her sister's schedule. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening, was the particular kind of silence that occurs when someone has just heard a boundary being stated with total clarity for perhaps the first time in their life, and Maria's mother said, with a tone that contained equal parts shock and something that might have been pride, well, if that is what you have decided, then of course we will honor that, and the conversation ended, and Maria sat in her apartment with her heart pounding in her chest, with her body flooded with adrenaline, with her nervous system screaming at her that she had just committed a catastrophic social violation, because she had said no to her mother, had said no to her sister, had prioritized her own needs above the family system's demand for harmony and accommodation, and even though she knew intellectually that this was healthy, even though her therapist had spent months coaching her toward exactly this kind of boundary setting, her body was still convinced that she had just committed a grave sin, that punishment would soon follow, that she had irrevocably damaged her relationship with her family. But the most extraordinary thing happened, and this is one of the mysteries of human psychology that deserves more attention than it typically receives, that when we state a boundary with complete clarity, with complete conviction, with the full knowledge that we are willing to accept the consequences of our boundary, the entire dynamic shifts, because people respond to our internal conviction, respond to our nervous system's sense of safety in the boundary, and if we are speaking the boundary, while we are internally terrified, while we are apologizing, while we are asking for permission, then people will push against that boundary as though it is merely a suggestion. But if we speak the boundary from a place of calm certainty, from a place of knowing that we will be okay even if the other person becomes angry, even if the other person rejects us, even if the family system destabilizes, then something in other people's nervous systems recognizes that this is not negotiable, that this is a true limit, and they adjust accordingly. Isabel, faced with this boundary, did what people often do when they have been denied access to their preferred strategy, and she shifted tactics. She pivoted to a new form of manipulation, and this one was more insidious, more carefully constructed, more designed to undermine Maria's confidence without being directly traceable to anything that Isabel had explicitly said or done. Because the most sophisticated forms of sabotage always look like they are the fault of the person being sabotaged, always appear to be evidence of their inadequacy, their poor planning, their lack of consideration. And this is how Isabel began to plant seeds of doubt about Maria's choice of wedding venue, about Maria's decision to have a small, intimate ceremony, about Maria's taste in flowers and music and food, and she did this very carefully, very strategically, by initially appearing to support these choices, by saying things like, "Oh, how lovely, such a unique vision, so Maria, so different from what most brides choose," and this particular inflection, this subtle emphasis on how unusual Maria's choices were, this gentle suggestion that most brides did something else, most brides chose something different, most brides aspired to something grander, began to work on Maria's internal landscape like water slowly wearing away stone. And here is where we need to understand something about how our nervous systems are shaped, particularly for women who grow up with critical sisters or mothers, particularly for those of us who were taught that our worth was contingent, conditional, dependent upon external validation, because our brains literally develop different neural pathways than those of children who grew up in environments of unconditional acceptance and support, because the amygdala, which is the alarm center of the brain, becomes hyperactive, becomes overly sensitive to signs of social rejection or disapproval, becomes primed to detect threat in environments that are actually relatively safe. And so when Isabel began to make these gentle suggestions about Maria's wedding choices, Maria's brain was interpreting each comment as a serious threat to her social standing, to her acceptance within the family system, to her worthiness as a bride, and each comment was triggering a cascade of physiological responses, was flooding her system with small doses of cortisol, was keeping her nervous system in a state of chronic low-grade activation that she was barely conscious of but that was absolutely eroding her confidence and her joy. Maria began to second-guess herself, began to look at her beautiful invitations with doubt, began to wonder if the small guest list was actually selfish, if the intimate venue was actually insufficient, if her vision for the day was actually inadequate, and she found herself calling her mother more frequently, asking for reassurance, seeking external validation for choices that she had previously felt certain about. And this is the particular genius of psychological manipulation, that it does not require the manipulator to explicitly state a contradiction or make a direct attack, that it operates through suggestion and implication and the careful cultivation of doubt, and it is nearly impossible to defend against because you cannot point to anything concrete that was said and call it wrong, you cannot fight a shadow, you cannot wrestle with a whisper. The turning point came about 6 weeks before the wedding, and it arrived in the form of a phone call from Patricia, a close friend of Maria's from university, someone who had known her for 12 years, someone who had witnessed the entire arc of her life with Isabel, who had watched Maria apologize for things she did not do, who had seen Maria shrink herself in her sister's presence, who had listened to hours of Maria's self-doubt and second-guessing, and Patricia said to her, with the particular kind of directness that only true friendship permits, "I am watching you disappear again, I am watching you become smaller again, I am watching your sister poison this time that belongs to you, and you are letting her do it, and I need you to hear that this is happening, because I love you too much to pretend that I do not see it." And something inside Maria, some essential part of her that had been gradually drowning, suddenly gasped for air, suddenly recognized that she was indeed in danger, not in any physical way, but in a deeper, more insidious way, in the way that our spirits can be slowly suffocated by the people who are supposed to love us, and in that moment, Maria understood that she would have to do something that would require her to access a part of herself that she had rarely needed before, a part that was not about accommodation or kindness or family loyalty, but about survival, about the preservation of her own soul. The question that Maria asked herself, sitting alone in her apartment after Patricia's phone call, was not how can I make my sister understand how much she is hurting me, because Isabel would not care, because Isabel's need to diminish Maria was stronger than her capacity for empathy, but rather how can I protect myself, how can I accomplish what I came into this experience to do, how can I have my wedding day without allowing my sister to steal it from me, and this question led to a shift in strategy. Because instead of trying to convince Isabel of anything, instead of trying to make her understand, instead of trying to win her approval or earn her support, Maria decided to simply outsmart her, to use her sister's own patterns and strategies against her, to create a situation where Isabel's manipulations would have no soil in which to grow, where they would find no purchase, where they would simply slide away like water off glass. Maria realized that Isabel's power over her came primarily from access, from being inside her decision-making process, from being consulted and considered and asked for her opinion, and so Maria made a decision that was both simple and profound. She decided to stop seeking her sister's input, to stop asking for her reassurance, to stop reporting on her plans, and instead to move through the final weeks before the wedding in quiet certainty, in peaceful isolation, in a kind of protective solitude that would not give Isabel any information to work with, any doubts to magnify, any insecurities to weaponize, and this decision activated something in Maria's nervous system that had been dormant for a very long time, something that we might call self-protection, but which is actually much deeper than that, which is actually the fundamental human capacity to prioritize our own well-being, to say that my life matters, my dreams matter, my joy matters, and I will not sacrifice any of these things on the altar of family harmony. What happened next was extraordinarily subtle, but it was also absolutely decisive, because when Maria stopped seeking validation from her sister, when she stopped asking whether her wedding choices were acceptable, when she stopped performing uncertainty in order to invite Isabel into her decision-making process, something shifted in the family dynamic. Because people like Isabel operate through a particular kind of psychological economy, they feed on the energy that is generated when others seek their approval, and when that energy source is cut off, they experience it as a form of deprivation, as a loss of power, and so Isabel began to escalate, began to make more direct attacks, began to criticize not just Maria's wedding choices but Maria herself, making comments about her appearance, about her career choices, about her relationship, all of which was actually a sign that Maria's strategy was working. Because Isabel was now operating from a place of desperation rather than from a place of confident control. But Maria did not take the bait, and this is where the real wisdom of her strategy became clear, because she understood something fundamental about conflict, which is that conflict requires participation from both sides, that it requires the person being attacked to defend themselves, to explain themselves, to justify themselves, to engage in the battle. And if one person simply refuses to engage, if they remove themselves from the field of combat, then the other person is left standing alone with their weapons, is left performing their attack on thin air, and this is what Maria did. She became what Buddhists call wu wei. She became like water, like empty space, like the sky that allows clouds to pass through without resistance. And every time Isabel made a cruel comment, every time she criticized, every time she tried to pull Maria into conflict, Maria simply nodded, said something non-committal, and moved the conversation to another topic, and this consistent refusal to engage in the game that Isabel wanted to play was far more powerful than any argument Maria could have made. 3 weeks before the wedding, Isabel came to Maria's apartment ostensibly to see the wedding dress, and this was actually a final reconnaissance mission, a last attempt to find some information, some doubt, some insecurity that she could exploit. But when she arrived, she found Maria calm, certain, radiant in a way that Isabel had rarely seen her, and Maria showed her the dress without apologizing for its simplicity, without explaining her choices, without seeking Isabel's approval. And when Isabel made a comment about how different it was from what most brides chose, Maria simply smiled and said, "Yes, it is exactly what I wanted," and moved on to asking Isabel about her work, about her own life, about something that had absolutely nothing to do with the wedding. And this redirection, this subtle but complete lack of interest in whether Isabel approved of her choices, was like a door closing in Isabel's face, was like a light turning off that Isabel had been trying to shine into Maria's psyche, and something inside Isabel recognized in that moment that she had lost, that whatever power she had once had over her sister had somehow evaporated, had been starved of the fuel that it needed to survive. What happened on the day of the wedding itself was almost anticlimactic, because all of the real drama had already been resolved, all of the psychological maneuvering had already been concluded, and what remained was simply the event itself, the actual celebration, and it began with the sunrise, with the pale pink light spreading across the chapel in the small town where their family was from, a place that Maria had chosen precisely because it felt like home, felt like the physical manifestation of her own internal landscape. And as she stood in the small room off to the side of the chapel, wearing the dress that she had chosen without apology, wearing the jewelry that her grandmother had worn, her hands trembling slightly not with doubt but with the full force of her emotions, she felt her mother's hands on her shoulders, and her mother said, "You look like yourself." And this simple statement, this recognition that Maria was not trying to be anyone other than who she was, made her realize something fundamental, which is that all of the anxiety, all of the self-doubt, all of the questioning had been generated not from within her own truth but from her internalization of her sister's criticism, from her acceptance of the premise that she needed to be something other than what she was in order to be worthy of love and celebration. When she walked down the aisle and saw David waiting at the altar, when she saw the expression on his face, when she understood in her body rather than just in her mind that this man chose her, that he loved her, that he was thrilled to marry her, something inside her that had been coiled and tight and defensive for her entire life simply let go, and she felt the muscles in her chest relax, felt the tension in her shoulders melt, felt her nervous system recognize that she was safe, that she was loved, that she was enough. And this is the moment that the story is really about, because this moment of self-recognition, this moment of finally believing that she was worthy, was the real victory, not over her sister, but over all the internal narratives that her sister had helped to construct, all the beliefs about herself that Maria had been carrying since childhood. Isabel watched the ceremony from a pew in the middle of the chapel, and by all external appearances she was gracious, she smiled appropriately, she clapped when other people clapped, she behaved like a supportive sister, and no one who did not know her well would have detected the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her hands were gripped too tightly in her lap, the particular angle of her head that suggested she was not entirely present but was instead conducting some internal accounting, some calculation of how much had been lost, how much power had been given away. And after the ceremony, during the reception, Isabel made her way to Maria and congratulated her with words that were correct and appropriate and completely hollow, and Maria received the congratulations with grace, not because she had forgiven her sister, not because she was pretending that no harm had been done, but because she understood something important about forgiveness, which is that it does not require us to absolve the other person of responsibility, that it does not require us to forget or to minimize the harm that was caused, but rather that it is primarily a gesture we make toward ourselves, a way of releasing the grip that another person has on our nervous system, a way of taking back the energy that we have been spending on processing their cruelty. And so Maria could forgive Isabel without pretending that Isabel was anything other than what she was, could forgive her while simultaneously refusing to give her any more access to her internal world. As the night progressed, as the reception became looser and more joyful, as people danced and celebrated and toasted Maria and David, something shifted in Isabel's experience, something that happens when we realize that our strategies have failed, that the world has not rearranged itself to accommodate our needs, that other people are going to live their lives regardless of whether we approve or not, and this recognition, while painful, is also liberating in a way, because it represents the beginning of a process of recalibration, of the nervous system beginning to understand that it cannot control everything, that it must find a way to feel safe in a world where other people have agency, where other people will make choices we don't approve of, where other people will succeed without our permission or our blessing. And while Isabel was not ready to undergo this transformation on the night of Maria's wedding, the seeds of it had been planted, the possibility of it had been introduced into her consciousness, and sometimes that is all that is required to begin the long, difficult work of growing up, of becoming a person rather than simply a collection of defense mechanisms and counterattacks. In the weeks and months after the wedding, Maria found herself in a fascinating position, because she had accessed a part of her power that she did not know existed, and this access fundamentally changed her relationship with her sister, not because they suddenly became close, not because Isabel suddenly became a good person, but because Maria had proven to herself that she could have what she wanted even when her sister opposed her, that she could build a beautiful life even when her sister tried to undermine it, that she could be happy even when her sister was unhappy, and this knowledge changed something in the structure of Maria's personality, changed the way she moved through the world, changed the way she related to other people who tried to exert control over her. And this is the real story, not a story about one sister defeating another sister, but a story about how each of us has to eventually come to the realization that our own lives belong to us, that no one else gets to determine the narrative of our existence, that the only real victory is the one we achieve over the parts of ourselves that have been told that we are not worthy of taking up space, that we are not deserving of joy, that we should make ourselves smaller so that other people can feel larger. Maria's wedding day was beautiful, was exactly what she had imagined, was a celebration of her love and her commitment and her life, and in the weeks after, as she and David began to integrate their lives, as they began the ordinary, extraordinary work of building a marriage, something inside Maria was also being rebuilt, her sense of self, her internal compass, her capacity to trust her own instincts and desires without constantly checking them against external feedback, and this rebuilding was ongoing, was not a single event that happened once and was then complete, but rather a continuous practice of recognizing when she was about to abandon herself in the service of making someone else comfortable, and choosing instead to stay true to her own truth, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was difficult, even when it required her to disappoint other people. The neuroscience of what happened inside Maria's brain during this process is quite remarkable, because when she began to stand up for herself, when she began to establish boundaries with her sister, when she began to make decisions based on her own desires rather than on her fear of her sister's disapproval, her brain was literally rewiring itself, was creating new neural pathways, was strengthening the connections between different regions that handle self-confidence, emotional regulation, and clear decision-making, and it is this neural rewiring that is the real foundation of her freedom, because it is not enough to simply make the conscious decision to stand up for ourselves, we also have to allow our bodies, our nervous systems, our fundamental sense of safety in the world, to reorganize themselves around this new way of being, and this takes time, takes repetition, takes the consistent reinforcement of the new patterns through hundreds and thousands of small moments where we choose ourselves, where we honor our own needs, where we refuse to abandon ourselves in the service of maintaining someone else's comfort. And so perhaps that is what we are meant to take from Maria's story, not a simple moral that good triumphs over evil, or that standing up for ourselves always leads to happy endings, but rather a more nuanced and complicated truth, which is that when we finally decide that our own lives matter, when we finally believe that we are worthy of the same consideration and care that we give so freely to everyone else, When we finally understand that the architecture of our relationships can be rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than mutual obligation, that is when everything changes, not because other people suddenly stop being difficult, not because conflict disappears from our lives, but because we have access to a source of power within ourselves that is independent of whether other people approve of us, whether they love us, whether they think we are making the right choices. And this is a power that cannot be taken away, cannot be stolen, cannot be undermined by someone else's cruelty or manipulation or fear, because it comes from the deepest part of who we are, from the part of us that knows that simply by existing, simply by being born into this world, we are already enough, we already deserve to be here, we already matter, and everything else is just learning to believe in what was always true.